Folks, welcome to our second lecture where we're going to be talking about Laurie Anderson and McClary's essay on Laurie Anderson. So just really quickly before we start, this is properly a piece on music, even though it talks a lot about her performative aspects of her work, of the performative aspects of Laurie Anderson's work. I don't really need you to focus on the parts that deal with music theory. It is interesting, I think, to read those parts as an example of how we might think about the work that music can do or does as part of a multi-textual performance, and we'll talk about that a little bit as we move on. But in general, our focus here is going to be on the performative elements of Laurie Anderson's music and its relationship to technology and its relationship to the Donna Haraway essay that we read before, or that we talked about in the last lecture. So to start then, I had you watch at the end of the last lecture two Laurie Anderson videos. One of them is just a music video without any video behind it, so not technically a multi-text performance, although it is a poem set to music, so it is technically a multi-text performance. And then the second one being the excerpt from her film, Heart of a Dog, and the particular track from the air when she talks about her relationship with her own dog, and the comparison that she stages between the dog's response to being attacked by hawks in the mountains and the experience she has had of her neighbors watching the sky after September 11th. So I wanted to introduce both of these as examples because I think they both work to create the destabilization between binary oppositions that Donna Haraway is talking about in her essay, especially the oppositions between nature and culture, and between technology and the natural world, between humans and animals. All of these things, I think, are things that get destabilized really well in Laurie Anderson's work, and I think that it's interesting to look at these as two sort of very different examples of how this happens. Because in the first example, we're given much more of a mythic sort of retelling of Adam and Eve, a mythic retelling of Adam and Eve. And this is the example that McClary opens with as well, and she summarizes the function of the text this way. She says, with the lightest of touches, Anderson sets up what seems at first glance the standard binary oppositions underpinning Western knowledge: anthropologist slash primitive, human, nature, truth, fiction, authenticity, corruption, Western, non-Western, male and female. She then tilts these slightly so that they begin to slip. So we have this idea here then that Anderson is engaging in a form of play, in the mythological retelling of an origin story that is oftentimes used to enforce these Western cultural binaries or to naturalize these Western cultural binaries, but instead she retells the story in a way that challenges the distinction between these poles. The snake has legs, it talks to her. Female pleasure is one of the central driving forces in the origin of the world and isn't ashamed. She grows disinterested with Adam because of his perpetual happiness and his simplicity. All of these sort of put on its head this origin story through this very slow and sort of trance-like narration. And something that the title talks about, and something we should think about here, is it says, this is not a story my people tell. And the question that McClary raises is, well, who are Laurie Anderson's people? Who are Laurie Anderson's people? And she says that if the people that Laurie Anderson is referring to are the people of Western culture, then this certainly isn't a story her people tell, because it has this mythological quality of telling a story about the origin of the world as being the origin of female pleasure, as being the origin of playfulness and a love for language, that all of these things are things that are completely unorthodox, and I think subvert the boundaries between men and women, between nature and culture, between nature and humans, in a way that we've been talking about through Haraway's work as being highly feminist. So this is the first major way I think we want to think about Laurie Anderson as being a feminist artist, is that in her performances, in her poetry in particular, she's always interested in playing with these binary oppositions that many feminists identify as being so problematic. And I think we see a really beautiful example of this in the second piece, From the Air, which is a longer piece. I hope that you had time to read through all of it, or to listen through all of it. And please, if you haven't, go back to it now, and take the time to get all the way through it. Because I think that's something that is really interesting that happens in this piece, is that it follows exactly, in many ways, McClary says about Long Demore, The Language of Love, the piece we were just discussing, and that it starts out with what seems like a very anthropocentric, that is human-oriented narrative about Laurie Anderson and her relationship with nature, but one in which she articulates that she has, since she was a young child, felt this spiritual or natural connection with the air. What happens next is she talks about training her dog and going for a walk with her dog. So there's a distinction that's drawn between her and her animal, in which she is the animal's protector and the animal's trainer. So there is a binary opposition between human and animal drawn there. But as the piece progresses, that binary collapses because she describes the way that the dog fixates on these hawks that are circulating or circling rather, sorry, it over it in the sky. That the hawks are threatening the dog, and the dog for the first time realizes it can be threatened from the sky. And she compares that from the looks she sees on people she knows in New York after 9/11 who had that same internalization, that suddenly they could be threatened from the air. And that's where the title comes from. And she is talking about here, what she does here then, I think, is tell this very interesting and gripping narrative that ultimately ends up deconstructing the difference between human and non-human experiences of fear, that compares one of the most fundamental events to ever happen in Western culture, one of the most destabilizing and terrible events to ever happen in the United States, to something that happens to animals, not to invalidate it, but to explain and illustrate the universality or the shared nature of that fear, even though obviously the fear of a dog and the fear of an individual are different. The idea here is, much like Haraway says, making partial connections, not saying, like the fear of a dog is the same as the fear of a person, but seeing continuities between the natural world and the human world in her interactions with her dog. So I think that these are two good examples from Laurie Anderson's work of the ways that she is interested in deconstructing some of the same binaries that Haraway is, between the human and the non-human, between the rational and the emotional, between men and women, that all of these things are things that she's interested in interrogating. And then one of the main ways in which she does this, the second thing that we should talk about, is through multitextuality. So that is, again, one of the main reasons we're spending so much time talking about Laurie Anderson today, is that she is a performance artist who incorporates all different forms of textuality in her own work. So Long Demore, for instance, she says, is published in a literary text that Laurie Anderson released to accompany one of her performances or one of her tours called America. And in that, Long Demore is reproduced as if it were an anthropological or a structuralist study of another culture. So that adds to, then, the textual dimensions that are already in her work. In another example, or in the other example, we can see that she literally has made a film to accompany her work. And this film has sound elements that go above the elements that you would hear in the recorded version of the song. So there is a multitextuality there that grants it a different kind of meaning or a different kind of experience. In a later example, we'll watch the video or the music video for Oh Superman. Music videos are another form of textuality that accompany, in this case, poetry and poetic and a musical composition that is then set to video, but a different kind of video than a full-length film. In other circumstances we've watched previously her performances. All of these things have to do with multitextuality. And something that McClary emphasizes is that Laurie Anderson's work is all about bringing these different discourses into combination, bringing them together. So we want to think then about how that technique might express some of the parts of feminism we've been talking about. So we can think, for instance, about how by assembling multiple voices, by speaking from different perspectives at the same time, by assembling different texts together to speak, we might be better able to capture and bring together partial perspectives on the world without saying they mean the same thing or are necessarily complementary. In other words, retaining the contradictions that Haraway talks about as being essential to irony, but still presenting things side by side or in combination to give them new resonance, And this is, I think, one of the main things that multitextual performances really help us do. We can think about our supplementary scores in multitextual performances as being complements, but we can also think about them as being in tension, as being in dialogue. So we're creating a relationship between all of the texts that we incorporate, and that relationship doesn't have to be one of unity. It can be one of contradiction. It can be one where different contradictory perspectives are expressed, and many of you did a really good job of this in your own responses to your spoken word performances. So I think that this is a really interesting thing that we see in Laurie Anderson's own incorporations of multitextuality, and we're going to talk about that for the rest of this time, particularly in terms of technology and the body. But before we get there, I wanted to return to one of our older examples, which is not from Laurie Anderson, which is the video that I shared for you of Gil Scott-Heron's The Revolution Will Not Be Televised. The Revolution Will Not Be Televised, which is a poem that was written in the 1970s. So in the 1970s, police brutality and many of the issues that Gil Scott-Heron describes in these poems were still active. But in the video I sent you, this music is paired to a slideshow of the George Floyd protests over police brutality. And so you get, I think, this interesting effect from that pairing where you're taking something old and something contemporary, and by looking at them side by side, you get the sensibility that things have not, in fact, changed. And that is, I think, another really interesting thing that multitextual performances can do, is bring things that are in tension together and allow us to see by, for instance, taking a text written by somebody in the 1970s or the early 1980s at the latest and comparing it to a text or to photographs taken in our contemporary day, we can get this shock by putting these texts together where we see at the end of our experience, we perceive through our experience of watching this music video how the political situation that we are in right now is something that repeats through history. It's interesting because I think if you think about Black Klansman, which is a Spike Lee movie that came out a couple of years ago about a black police officer who helps infiltrate the KKK, that movie ends in a similar way. It's not really spoilers or anything, but that movie is set when David Duke was the head of the KKK many decades ago, and at the end of the film, jump cuts to the scene or the video recording of Heather Heyer being run over in Charlottesville and the violence that happened because of white supremacist protests in Charlottesville in 2016. So we have a similar kind of multitextual shock there, where Spike Lee took his film, which he made himself, and then blended found footage with his film at the ending to create this multitextual shock of dissonance. So when we think about multitextuality, then we're always thinking about putting things together, and that helps us break down things that already might be thought about in terms of binary oppositions, the old and the new. Different perspectives on the world can be brought into synthesis, and it doesn't mean that their differences disappear. It means that those differences can be productive, how we can see how those differences are effective, or we can see through the differences between texts certain effects being produced by juxtaposing them together or by presenting them side by side. So that's what I wanted to say mostly about multitextuality. In terms of Laurie Anderson's work, we see this in her willingness and constant desire to push boundaries between what is a poem, what is music, what is performance art, what is film, that all of these things are always being blended together in her own work. So to talk about that then, more specifically in terms of feminism and its relationship to performance art, something that I think McClary does a really good job pointing to, which connects things back to our discussion of Haraway, is that in Western culture, there is a suspicion, she says, of the body. There is a suspicion of the body. And she calls it an idealist suspicion, which means that it is, we think about thought as being dominant over the body, as we've talked about before. So you can think about this in terms of the Porter reading on body intellectuals. You can think about this in terms of Concord Good's Poetics, Process, Play, and Power. We've talked about all throughout the semester how the body is something that is oftentimes excluded in Western culture as being a meaningful site of knowledge or a meaningful site of experience, that it's all about the mind and thought and language. And she says that McClary says that even in music, there is still this emphasis on that the way in which people, bodies, don't actually produce the sounds that make music. That performing music is all about, in some ways, disciplining the body to the instrument or to the technology or to the musical piece so that your body falls in line with everybody else performing. So, for instance, if you're performing in an orchestra, you're not supposed to sound like you have a unique body that's performing. You're supposed to sound like everybody else, unless perhaps you are a soloist. So she says then that, quote, Western culture, through its puritanical idealist suspicion of the body, has tried throughout much of its history to forget the fact that actually people usually produce the sounds that make music. That is, people who predominantly make music. And what McClary argues here is that the incorporation of performance art into music, that form of multitextuality, is something that Laurie Anderson uses in many ways to re-embody music, and that is one of the reasons why her performance can be considered feminist. So she says, quote, McClary says, one of the principal features of performance art is the insistence on the artist as the performing body. The piece is that which is inscribed on and through the body. The piece is that which is inscribed on and through the body. So you can think about then the ways in which, reflecting back to the German performance of her playing body percussion that we watched at the beginning of class, or like many weeks ago as an example of performance, we can think about the way the electronics literally are part of her body in that circumstance. We're about to watch an excerpt from Oh Superman, or the music video for Oh Superman, which is another example of how Laurie Anderson uses vocoding, which is a particular type of music technology, to mask her voice, to make herself into different characters and sometimes disembodied voices of judgment or of nature, of authority, that allows her to play act and not just be the object of the music. So she talks about then, McClary talks about how Laurie Anderson's relationship to technology and relationship to performance allows her to multiply her own presence. She is not just one body anymore in her performance. She is the singer, the musician, the body that is performing, the percussion. She embodies all of these different perspectives. So both in terms of her narratives being and drawing multiple different texts or narrations together, and in terms of her performance, she splits herself into multiple places. So the idea here is that she is no longer the subject or the object object of musical experience, that she is neither, that in her performances, she puts her own body into this central place where it becomes fundamentally part of the music. So the distinction between subject, her, and object collapses. Her body is not an object for the performance of some pre-written music or a subject that commands technology. It is something that works along or in tandem with all of these things. Along or in tandem with all of these things. So the next connection McClary makes in this discussion of the subject-object distinction, is by talking about how this works to subvert or deconstruct the way that women are typically objectified inside of musical performance worlds. That is that in music and entertainment, women are oftentimes subjected to something called the gaze, G-A-Z-E, so to look, that men are not, which is, or less often at least, which is that they are evaluated for their sexualized bodies over and against anything involved in the artistic dimension of the performance. And what McClary wants to argue about Laurie Anderson's performances is that through playing androgyny, playing an androgynous individual, so having a short haircut, appearing in clothing that is gender neutral, she in that way offsets her femininity in a manner that allows her to be taken more seriously as a performer, but also through the use of vocoding and electronics to mask her vocals or to make her vocals multiple, to let her embody multiple different personas through the silliness and the way in which she moves through different characters in her performance, through this blending of multiple texts together, that what she does is displace her own body as something to be objectified, but makes it part of this overall organic sort of process. Or, I mean, not organic in the sense of like it is not technological, but organic in sense of she is working in harmony with machines and with music, and multiplying her own identities in order to create this thing that is larger than herself. And in McClary's analysis, then, that decenters her sexuality as the primary part of her performances, which is something that, again, allows her to not be treated as an object in her performances in the same way that somebody, so for instance, McClary references Madonna, might be treated as an object to be objectified in the moment of her performances. Laurie Anderson's work with multiple texts, her work with androgyny, and her work with technology all work together to subvert that objectification. So far then we've talked about Laurie Anderson's work as interrogating the same types of boundaries that Donna Haraway is critiquing through a number of different means. Through one, narrating the consistencies or the articulations between human and animal experience. Two, through multi-text performances working in close relationship with technology. So therefore destabilizing the human technological boundary through cloaking her voice, through using electronic instrumentation, through all of those sorts of techniques. And then through also other sorts of multitextuality, where through creating books or films, she puts multiple voices and images in conversation with each other to destabilize the idea that there is one perspective and to create many partial knowledges instead of saying that there is one universal truth about being a woman or about being in Western civilization or anything like that. So those are the main ways so far that McClary has, I think, productively talked about Laurie Anderson's work. The next part, which is one of the more important parts, is actually going to be a moment in which I slightly disagree with McClary. So first of all, she talks about, when she's talking about, oh, Superman, and we had just talked about this, how Laurie Anderson puts her voice under various electronic masks, and this allows her to move through multiple points of view and to resist the sexualization of her own body. So we talked about that as something that's really important in her relationship with with technology, is that it is a way for her to practice androgyny and to subvert the expectations for a female performer. At the same time, though, McClary says that one of the ways in which Laurie Anderson's work is especially feminist is because she takes the place of men in the or in the technology human relationship, that is, in the subject object relationship. And this is a really important place where I think we can bring together a lot of things that we've been talking about so far. So just quickly, let me read the pull quote here, which is, quote, "When Anderson involves herself with electronics, she confuses still other habits of thought grounded in gender difference. It is supposed to be the man who gives birth to and tames the machine. To the extent that women and machines both occupy positions opposite of man in the standard dichotomies being binary oppositions, women and machines are incompatible terms. But as Anderson wrestles with technology, she displaces the male subject, who usually enacts the heroic feat." So, I want to think about this in two different ways. One of the ways is a way that I think this makes a really good point, and I think is something that we should use productively when we're thinking about the relationship between gender and technology, but also race and technology, which is the whole point of the subject-object tradition distinction, and and the way that we've been talking about it in both critical race theory, and in theories of gender, is that it is the white man who usually is articulated as the subject in Western culture, that women are treated as objects to be sexually objectified, to reproduce biologically, to do household labor, and that similarly, machines and nature are viewed as at the disposal of humans. So, one thing that I think is really important that connects these things together is that when we think about gender and race, I think it's really important to think about the ways in which, in some ways, people of racially disenfranchised groups and women have been treated in some ways as technologies, or as ways of doing labor. So women are objectified and forced into household labor. In the history of slavery, slaves were an agricultural tool before industrial agricultural technology, and they were treated like a tool insofar as they were deprived of their basic humanity. So I think that there's a really, really important way in which it is absolutely true that when we think about the subject-object distinction, white men have been subjects and everything else has been an object in the way that Western culture produces those distinctions. So in part, then, the multi-text performance, or the important thing about technology, is that by breaking down the distinction between subject and object, by troubling this relationship, we can start to oppose that system of domination. And this is where I think that I want to get into a little bit of a disagreement with McClary in her discussion of Laurie Anderson's work, because she seems to say that Laurie Anderson's work is feminist because Laurie Anderson proves that women too can have agency over technology. And I think that while it is certainly true that Laurie Anderson knows how to use technology, that she is a virtuoso in her manipulations of this technology and was way ahead of her time as far as these things go, that at the same time, it might not be reflective of the politics of her work to say that she masters it or exerts mastery over it in the same way as we would talk about a subject dominating an object. That there is instead an idea that she works alongside of the technology that she uses, that the technology helps produce her work in the same way that she does, and so they're collaborators. And so the point that I'm trying to make here is that for Haraway. Donna Haraway, in our last discussion, what is important about the cyborg is that it allows us to imagine a world in which these boundaries between nature, between humans, between technologies, and in turn between gender identities and sexualities are all things we should destabilize, are all things that are porous. For to say then that what is feminist about Anderson's work is that she becomes a subject and dominates technology seems to, in some ways, contradict the idea of feminism as a way of getting rid of these problematic distinctions or challenging these binaries. So I would encourage us maybe to think about, is it true that we think that Laurie Anderson, through her performances, dominates technology, or is a subject that dominates her work? Or do we think that she, as Haraway would say, through her interactions with technology, erases these distinctions or problematizes these distinctions between nature and technology, between humans and nature, and between humans and technology? So I want us, for instance, to recall the German TV performance that we watched some time ago that I had just referenced a second ago, and I dropped another link to it in your outline or in the outline of the lecture notes. But I want us to think about how in her dancing with these tools attached to her body and her creating body percussion, how the tools dictate how she dances as much as her dance dictates what the tools do. How she is working perhaps with instead of over technology. Or is she? Maybe you disagree. Maybe you do feel like this creates this relationship between the individual and the technology in which she is the master of it, and it does reproduce the subject-object relationship. So I think that that's something we want to critically consider, because I think that when we think about electronic music today and the way that electronics works with art today, we see increasing popularities of music that is made in part by machines doing their own thing. So if you think about modular synthesizers are an example of this, which are synthesizers that are built, keyboard tone instruments that are electronic, synthesizers that are built out of analog wire patches that you cross over. What happens when you make those is that the synthesizer does its own thing, essentially. You have created it, but there is a randomness that is dependent on the circuitry of the thing that you have created. Similarly, a lot of hip hop and electronic music uses drum machines and arpeggiators, things where you put in the settings, but if you don't want to determine note by note what happens, you don't have to. That the algorithm that runs that virtual instrument makes those decisions for you. So I think that there's a way in which the relationship that people have with musical production is increasingly one of collaboration rather than domination of machines. But I'm interested in hearing your own perspectives on this. So in wrapping up our discussion then, I want to just set out the main things that we really want to consider here. We want to consider how, by working with different texts, so in multi-textual performances, but in particular by incorporating technology and different media into our performances, we might be capable of engaging in social critique by performatively destabilizing boundaries that are not productive for us. So by performatively destabilizing the idea that technology is something that we should dominate, that we should think about one side of a binary as being nature and one side of a binary as being human, and one side of a technology and one side as human, that all of these boundaries are things that we can deconstruct through multi-textual processes that allow us to voice many different perspectives at the same time, that allow us to allow others to speak at the same time as we are speaking or alongside us, that allows technology or nature to speak alongside us as we are speaking. And in that way, way, maybe we can think about multitextual performance and performing with technology as being politically productive. And one of the ways that McClary talks about this is by creating new forms of pleasure, that by working in association with machines, by destabilizing these boundaries and no longer feeling as if we must be the subject who dominates the world to our will, that maybe there are new ways of existing in the world that are productive when we say, this object, this technology is active, nature is active, these things are active in our world and construct my reality. And when I perform, I should not act as if I perform alone. I should act as if I am this sort of center that expresses all of these different influences. That is this place in which all of these partial perspectives and partial knowledges come together. And by embracing that partiality and that experimentation, I might be able to do something different or see something different than I otherwise might be able to. And so we talked about a lot of complex stuff today. And I, again, don't want to make the complexity the point here. The idea through this entire discussion is simply that we have a history of looking at gender in which women are treated as objects. We similarly have a history of configuring race in which certain people are subjects and certain people are objects. And that performance is about interrogating that relationship. And that through multitextual performances and through performances that incorporate and give agency to technology in particular, we might be able to think about breaking down some of these binaries that sustain oppressive social structures. So that is where we're going to leave off today. In addition to watching the examples that are posted in your video clips today, in addition to the reflection that I asked you to do at the end of the last lecture, the last thing that I want to ask you to do today is just to think about your own relationship to technology or other examples between of performers that you know or performances that you know that have a pronounced relationship to technology. And so as your attendance today, I would invite you to, in addition to what you normally do on YouTube videos or whatever, to send me an example or to post an example of something that you think is an interesting example of somebody who is using technology in a performative way, who is performing through technology, or how or an example of technology performing on its own, perhaps in our culture. Just think about this idea. How does technology perform? How do we perform alongside technology or use technology in performances? And what do you think the effects of that are? And if any relevant examples come up, just feel free, drop them in the YouTube comments or send me an email, or write about them in your next forums post would also be fine. But if you do it as an attendance activity or send it to me in advance, I'd be happy to share it with the class as other examples of this relationship. Because focusing on Laurie Anderson and her own work gives us one example, and I try to bring aboard Gil Scott Heron as another potential example in a different context, but please do feel free to share your own examples with me, and this is something that I'm interested in continuing to talk about as we continue to work. So, in any case, thanks for your attention today. I'm really looking forward to our performance workshop starting tomorrow. And again, I will post a lecture video that responds to your main performance or your last spoken word performances tomorrow as well. So hopefully that'll give you some productive things to think about when you are working on these new performances. But in any case, the instructions for what I expected for your workshops are at the beginning of the first video. So if you need a refresher on that, please feel free to flash back. But otherwise, I hope you have a great Wednesday, and I will talk to you tomorrow.